Hello, welcome to Expositions. I'm Kevin Rhodes. I do not know how many of you have money invested on Wall Street, but if you have, you must have felt like you've been on a world's worst roller coaster here in recent years. We've grown accustomed to steady growth, and that makes it hard on us when a correction hits. And interestingly enough, the same thing is true in the rest of life. We often make the assumption that everything is supposed to improve automatically as we go through life. We expect our wages to increase. We expect education to improve. We expect technology to help us with all sorts of tasks to the point of where we don't have to do that much. If you do not believe me, go take a look at some of the television commercials from the 1950s. But we also tend to think the same way spiritually. During the 50s and 60s, when the church was growing by leaps and bounds in some ways, people took that growth for granted. And they didn't really appreciate where it was coming from, how much of it was related to simply larger families and a larger generation obeying the gospel. But unfortunately, the church was unprepared for the twin problems of crossroads and liberalism that soon followed. So now in some ways, it seems like we're back at square one, or at least square three. But how do you think the faithful in Israel, as they took the land of Canaan under Joshua's leadership, must have felt? Their early success must have been something to behold. Yet their future during the days of the judges was pretty bleak. From the early days summarized in chapter 1 of the book of Judges, the author set the tone for the rest of the book. Success cannot be assumed, and problems are inevitable. That's not the cheeriest thought. It's not the most uplifting idea, but it is true. Therefore, it depends greatly on whether we acknowledge our problems and how we face then our problems if we're going to have success. So let's turn to Judges chapter 1 in this chapter that is essentially summarizing and pointed us to the theme of the entire book and establish for ourselves how much we have in common with the themes that we're going to find in this book at a point in Israel's time that is rather depressing. First of all, let's recognize this first principle. We all have problems. I hope that itself makes you feel a little better. And in some cases, I hope it gives you some perspective. Because after all, sometimes when people have problems, they get so caught up in what they're dealing with, they forget that other people have problems too. We have problems as a country. Of this there is no doubt. It's undeniable. In Proverbs 14 verse 34, there Solomon wrote that righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. And surely we see those kind of issues, and we can look at it through our history and see the truth of that statement. When you look around and you see what we have in various parts of the country especially, but as a whole, to think about how homosexuality has had such a dominating impact on politics, and now the transgender movement, that abortion still is a major issue, even as we try to curb its influence, when all the science on any one of these issues is clear, and that people have to deny scientific fact to be able to try to maintain their mantra. That shows where people are, that their hearts are far away from God, that they're not interested in truth. So those are problems. We can even look at the problems we have with other countries and the ups and downs, the problems of war, the interactions that we have, the dangers that exist with people that do not like us. But that's been true for most of time and will continue to be true. There are economic ups and downs. There are problems with certain companies. There are problems at a local level and down to where you can find people who will complain because they don't have all their streets smooth and they happen to have a pothole right in front of their house. It doesn't matter. We're going to have problems. We also, though, have problems in the church, both in following after the world liberally and in binding personal opinion. Either way, where we're just following the world along and loosening up what God has set as His standards and saying, well, everything that I don't like, I'll just call a cultural matter, and as the culture has changed, then it's okay today, when there's no justification for it, biblically speaking. But you also have the other side of where people get to where if they do not have complete agreement with their ideas, that they're ready to go into a war of words with people and end up really crushing unity unnecessarily in the Lord's church. It reminds of in Joshua chapter 1 and verse 7, where Joshua was warned to turn neither to the right hand nor to the left. Our responsibility is to stay so the straight and narrow as we consider Matthew chapter 7, 13 and 14. These are problems. We have problems in local congregations. There are problems that we found in 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 13 of ignorance. There is in that congregation about eschatology, and we still have that problem today. In John 17:21, it says that they may be one, as thou, Father, art in me, and I in thee, that they may be made one in us, that the world might believe that thou hast sent me. Do we have problems with unity today in congregations? Absolutely. Do we have problems with workers today? There's all this need, Matthew chapter 9, verses 37 through 38 points out, that the need is great. What we need are workers. And yet that's sometimes something we have problems with. And let's just admit it, we are all facing individual problems as well. We're not perfect. We have stress and strain in life, and we have to learn to overcome them. In Philippians 4, beginning in verse 4, it says, rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. Let your moderation be known unto all men, the Lord is at hand. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything through prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God, and let the peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. He then closes it. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. We have problems, but remember, we do have solutions that God offers to these as well, if we're willing to look for them. And so, we consider this. We will then, if we have problems, then we know this. We will face adversity. The very fact that we find in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, that be sober, be vigilant, for your adversary the devil is a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour, should tell us we're going to have problems. We're going to face adversity. But now as we go back to our text and look at some specifics, we want to consider some very pertinent kind of lessons that we need to learn. We must not allow worldly impediments to stop us from pursuing spiritual success. Think about what he says here in Judges chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. Also, Judah took Gaza with its territory, Askelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. So the Lord was with Judah, and they drove out the mountaineers, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the lowland because they had chariots of iron. Now, there was no reason why they couldn't have driven out those people with chariots of iron, except they weren't themselves convinced of it, committed to it, and willing to go until the very end with it. In Acts chapter 4, 19 and 20, there the apostles understood this very principle, that they could not but speak the things which they'd seen and heard, even though they were threatened. We must not allow someone threatening us or putting pressure on us to change an opinion. A lot of times, people look on us and they want to pressure us. The world wants to pressure us to conform to other ideas spiritually, to conform to what they want, to accept them in their error. But we must not. But rather in Acts chapter 5, verse 29, we ought to obey God rather than man. So don't let those worldly impediments get in the way. We also must not accept an unacceptable situation. In verse 21, it says, but the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem, so the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. They failed. That was their basic chore, the assignment given. Here's your land, drive out these people. That was the main hold in that area where the Jebusites were, which would have been Jerusalem, and the Benjamites did not take that on. They did not complete it. You think about in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 1, in which Paul talks about how there was this man who had taken his father's wife. He says, you're puffed up. He says, that's not right. And there are a lot of times we grow at ease in a congregation, And we grow to accept our situation as it is when God hasn't accepted it at all. Instead, He expects us to do something about it. So that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 6, Paul told the Thessalonians, withdraw yourselves from such a one. Anyone who walks disorderly, he says. You need to make sure to act. Why? We don't do that very much anymore today. Or we pay it lip service, we write letters, but do we really deal with the nitty-gritty details of here's a person, a soul in need, and deal with that person where they are in their sin to love them out of it or love them enough to show them where they stand with God through a withdrawal of our own social kind of circumstances to heighten their awareness of where they stand spiritually with God. But we sometimes, we look around and we just accept it. And that causes problems for them. It causes problems for us. And in that way, it causes problems for the church and for God. We should never let our enemy's determination be greater than our own. I want you to think about this from a political standpoint after we read verse 27. However, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean and its villages, or Taanach and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, for the Canaanites were determined to dwell in that land. The statement made, they were determined to dwell in that land. Well, that says they were some strong, you might say stubborn people. The question is why were the people of Manasseh not just as determined? Do you realize how often the problem we have as Christians is that we lack the determination enough to match up to Satan and the world's determination? That as they stand up to us, our determination needs to be stronger than what theirs is. It reminds me a lot of times of when I have observed situations where it is clear that the will of the child, the determination of a child, is much stronger than the will of the parent, because the parent is always giving in and the child is running the household. Well, in that same way, the Canaanites, by holding on and waiting out Manasseh and waiting for them to lose interest and lose their determination, they won. And it hurt them tremendously on a spiritual level. Think about then how when people come in, if they want to be so determined in preaching error, we must match that determination with truth. But also remember this, we must not grow impatient. We must also match it with love. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 12, the Apostle Paul says, I know whom I've believed and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day. This matters that we are willing to stay the course to do the will of our Savior. We cannot afford to give financial considerations more weight than spiritual considerations. Notice verse 28. And it came to pass when Israel was strong that they put the Canaanites under tribute, but did not completely drive them out. They thought it was good enough to get some money out of the deal. Maybe they decided that was a better deal than just wiping them out as they were supposed to do. But remember in Acts chapter 8 and verse 20 that Simon is told he must repent because of the nature of his heart, because he thought that a gift from God could be bought with money. He put a financial price on something God had said. And you think about how many times we can find people who will bring up the giving as the end-all be-all of the discussion. Whether it be if we do something to this person, then the family will stop giving, and it's all about the money instead of about God's will. We need to make sure we're doing God's will and let the financial things fall into place in faith. If we have to take a step back for a time because of it, of doing the right thing, then let's do it. But let's not be so short-sighted as the Israelites were to think that because we're better off financially, that means we obviously are going to be better off spiritually. It's usually quite the opposite being the case. We also can never allow past failures to become future standards. We read in verses 29 through 32. Nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer, so the Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them. Nor did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalal, so the Canaanites dwelt among them and were put under tribute. Nor did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Akko or the inhabitants of Sidon or of Adlab, Akzib, Helba, Aphik, or Rehob. Instead it says, So the Asherites dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. What one person in one tribe first did ultimately became a pattern. We cannot let those past failures to become ultimately, well, we did it already once, so it must be okay. Things are still working all right. So we just drop our standard down and we think it's okay, and now we'll just handle the money. And what you end up with is steady spiritual decline. You may not see it because the numbers may stay up, the contribution may stay up, but your relationship with God is actually going down, 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 and everything ultimately will follow that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, 9 through 11, we have to remember, though, that we've left things behind when we became Christians. No matter where we started, there were certain sins we had to get rid of and leave behind. And the danger is that we just decide at some point, I've done enough, and so I hold on to a few sins. I don't keep working at it, and this becomes my new norm. And all of a sudden, what our expectations are for ourselves and anyone else is less than what Christ expects. We must not grow so comfortable with a sinful society that we ignore its problems. Notice verse 33. Nor did Naphtali drive out the inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh or the inhabitants of Beth-Anath, but they dwelt among the Canaanites, inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh and the Beth-Anath were put under tribute to them. They ignored totally what was going on in their land, and they accepted them, and that would cause them problems. Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Friends, we should never run from our problems just because they are difficult. Notice again this problem beginning in verse 34. And the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountains, for they would not allow them to come down to the valley. And the Amorites were determined to dwell in Mount Heres, in Aijalon, and in Shalbim. They were determined, and essentially they just ran away from the problems. It was too hard. You think about Jesus in the garden, asking if this cup could pass from him. And he says in the end, though, nevertheless, not as I will, but thy will be done. Matthew 26:39. We need to make sure we're not just letting this rule our lives. We run into problems when we think we're stronger than we really are, and that's what you see this last part. Yet when the strength of the house of Joseph became greater, they were put under tribute. They were stronger, but not strong enough spiritually to do what needed to be done. If any man thinketh he standeth, take heed lest he fall. We must not let anyone other than God set boundaries for what we can accomplish. The final verse says, now the boundary of the Amorites was from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah and upward. God had already established those boundaries under Joshua, yet they had accepted something else. In Mark 16, verses 15 and 16, God has set a boundary. He set a boundary for what it is to become a Christian. Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned. A lot of people in the world have changed that boundary. God doesn't accept it. God keeps his boundary and recognizes the boundary he set. And we don't have a right to change it. All of these are issues where we come under pressure that we kind of wilt to the adversity and we just don't rise to the occasion. We need to do better. Good news is I'm here to tell you that you can, because we can succeed. You may have wondered why we skipped to the middle of the chapter at first. It's because I wanted to make sure we ended here. In 1 John chapter 5 and verse 4, there John said, this is the victory which overcomes the world, even our faith. The more we trust God and do things his way, the more assured we can be of success. Now we have to recognize success for what it is, and success following the path that God says is spiritual success, but it's still success. We can succeed if we will fight the enemy. You see, there are requirements there. Notice then, going back to Judges 1 and verse 1. Now after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall be first to go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? It wasn't a matter of who should go up, but who should go first. When they first decided it, they knew they needed to fight, and they didn't even question that. The other problems came later. We need to make sure this is where we stay, that we know we need to fight. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5, there Paul describes what we go through as spiritual warfare, and that we need to make sure that we truly are committed to a warfare of where we pull up the sword of the Spirit and we go in wanting to conquer people's wills to get them to accept God's will through our persuasion of the gospel. We can succeed, but we've got to fight the enemy. The enemy, you'll recall, is not other people. They are under the sway of an enemy. They are in the hands of an enemy, essentially bought, paid for by Satan. We need to go to war with Satan to free them. Now, that means talking to them. That means helping them see the error of their ways and that they've accepted something they never should have accepted, that there's a better way and a far greater master. We can succeed though, but we've first got to fight. We also can succeed if we learn to put things into the hands of our God. In verse 2 it says, "And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Indeed, I have delivered the land into his hand." Now notice a couple of things here. First, that they asked the Lord, they put it into his hands, and then they trusted by this statement, it was God who won the victory. In 2 Corinthians 5, verse 7, it says that we walk by faith and not by sight. And that's really descriptive of this situation. It was first of all trusting what God said and then following through to do it exactly how he said it, trusting that God was the one who was making things work in the first place. This is why in 1 Peter 5 verse 7 we can say, casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you. So many of our problems that hold us back are we fail to let go of things, we try to control everything, and we fail to realize when things are beyond our control and to hand them over to God. Our faith needs to be strong enough to recognize when something is beyond us, and we need to pray about it. We need to make sure we're committed and doing things his way, and that we're bringing other people in if necessary, but to realize that many things are just in God's hands and that is not a reason to stop. It's not a reason to somehow pull back. It's sometimes a reason just to endure. We have to hand things over to God more so that we can let go of the frustration and realizing we can't take responsibility for, say, other people's refusal to obey the gospel. We can't take responsibility for other people who have chosen to leave the faith. We can't take responsibility for people who have chosen to preach false doctrine, but we can take responsibility for what we are doing and trust that God can handle the rest. We need to be a people who can be positive of the success that's possible in any environment if we really trust God. And that means something else for us. We need to be able to look around within the local congregation as well as within the brotherhood and know that we can succeed if we work together. Let's notice verses 3 through 7. "So Judah said to Simeon his brother, Come up with me to my allotted territory, that we may fight against the Canaanites, and I will likewise go with you to your allotted territory. And Simeon went with him. Then Judah went up, and the Lord delivered the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they killed 10,000 men at Bezek. And they found Adoni-Bezek in Bezek, and fought against him, and they defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Then Adoni-Bezek fled, and they pursued him and caught him, and cut off his thumbs and big toes. And Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to gather scraps around my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. Then they brought him to Jerusalem, and there he died." The success here was Judah obeying, but also bringing others along. Now you'll remember that Simeon's territory fell within the overall boundaries of Judah's territory. It was a natural match. But it was also a matter of reaching out to say we can do this together. We ought to do this together. In Ephesians 4:15 through 16, we should see this model in the church, not just as they did in the first century with how the spiritual gifts would work together and how the church could be unified, speaking the truth in love and being one together, but realize this is our principle throughout all that we do if we'll take it seriously. Brethren, we can succeed if we will use small successes to build momentum for even greater successes. Notice verses 8 through 10. Now the children of Judah fought against Jerusalem and took it, and they struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. And afterward the children of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites who dwelt in the mountains in the south and in the lowland. Then Judah went against the Canaanites who dwelt in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron was formerly Kirjath-Arba, and they killed Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. They built upon these successes, and that's what we need to do. Just work at doing what you need to do, and then with some success, you'll find it much easier to keep going on, and you can build on that, and there'll be more people on board because they see things working. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. 1 Corinthians 3, verse 6. We also can succeed when all of us realize what we have to gain personally. Verses 11 through 15. From there they went against the inhabitants of Debir. The name of Debir was formerly Kirjath-Sepher. Then Caleb said, whoever attacks Kirjath-Sepher and takes it, to him I will give my daughter Achsah as wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it. So he gave him his daughter Achsah as wife. Now it happened when she came to him that she urged him to ask her father for a field, and she dismounted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, what do you wish? So she said to him, give me a blessing, since you have given me land in the south, give me also springs of water. And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. We've seen this earlier in the book of Joshua. But notice, there was something personal about it, and that made this work. Take things personally in the church. Put your own investment into it, make it matter to you, and more can possibly be done. You'll be more committed, and others will see it. When we can have success, but we have to finish what we start. Verses 16 and 17. The children of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of palms with the children of Judah into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the south near Arad, and they went and dwelt among the people. And Judah went with his brother Simeon, and they attacked the Canaanites who inhabited Zarephath and utterly destroyed it. So the name of the city was called Hermah. They did follow up. We can succeed when we rise to the challenge instead of just doing what's easy. That's what we see in verse 20, as well as in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 13. Rise up, don't expect everything to be easy. And then finally, we can succeed as long as the Lord is with us. This is what we see in verses 22 through 26. Remember what Joshua heard in Joshua 1, verse 9? It was about staying with the Lord, and that's where success is found. You know, there are certain realities we face as a congregation of God's people, as the church as a whole. Many older Christians who've witnessed successes and heartaches are all over the church. But that means we need to train up a next generation of leaders, teachers, and workers, and you can be among them. There are going to be ups and downs, but if you'll stay with God and have faith, you can overcome adversity and you will be successful. I'm Kevin Rhodes. Thank you for watching Expositions.